Hello, everyone. My name is Paul Turner from commissioningandstartup.com, and I help people and projects succeed at commissioning. So we've got a great presentation lined up for you today. Today's topic is cybersecurity during commissioning. It's a fairly complex topic, but we'll get into all the details and let's get right into it. So for today's discussion, I'll start with a little bit of my commissioning experience. We'll spend most of the time focusing on cybersecurity during commissioning. I'll tell you a little bit about my upcoming electrical commissioning course, and then we'll have a live question and answer at the end of the session where we'll go through any questions that you have about the presentation or about commissioning in general. So we're broadcasting on Facebook, YouTube, and LinkedIn. You can tune in and watch the replay on any of these channels once we complete this live webinar. And we're also responding to questions on all three of these platforms. So as I'm going through the information, please submit any questions that you have, and then we'll answer them at the end of the discussion. Also, there's a certificate available for participation in this webinar. Please stay to the end of the webinar and I'll let you know how you can access the certificate. So a little bit about me for those that are new to this webinar series. My name is Paul Turner. I'm a professional electrical engineer and I'm a registered project management professional. I have over 20 years of experience working with complex systems, and I'll share some of that experience with you here. I have a wonderful family. We live in Canada and we love to explore the outdoors. So some of the projects I've worked on in the aerospace industry, I've worked on satellites and rockets for the Canadian Space Agency. I have payloads that I've worked on the International Space Station. In power generation, I've worked on a 200 megawatt hydroelectric generating station in northern Canada. Power transmission, I was the commissioning manager for a 2300 megawatt HVDC link, which was a $5.2 billion project that we delivered on time and on budget. And currently, I'm the commissioning manager for a wastewater treatment plant that we are upgrading and expanding the existing facilities. So today's topic of discussion is cybersecurity during commissioning. In North America, cybersecurity compliance is governed by NERC. NERC stands for North American Electric Reliability Corporation, and the NERC CIP standards are what governs existing facilities and new projects and provide guidelines on physical and cybersecurity of in-service assets. All in-scope NERC CIP assets must be NERC CIP compliant before being connected to the bulk electric system. So that's great, but what does that all actually mean? Let's start with what is a NERC CIP asset. CIP stands for Critical Infrastructure Protection. This is any device with an addressable port. So this would typically be your Cat5 or Cat6 cables, your LAN connections, but it could be others, anything that has a addressable communication port. It could be a device that is connected to a network or not connected to a network. And it could also be even an internal network. So if your internal network is strictly within the perimeter of your fence line and has no physical connection outside to the outside world, it's still in scope for NERC CIP. So what this isn't would be a serial connection, say like an RS-232 connection. That's not an addressable port, so that's not in scope for NERC CIP. But anything else that does have an addressable port is in scope for NERC CIP. Some examples would be if you've got a PLC cubicle out in the field and it's got a communication card in it, a network card or something, that would be an in-scope NERC CIP asset. You say you have a transformer control panel and it's got an Ethernet interface card in there. That would be, that entire panel would be NERC CIP, in scope for NERC CIP. All your control and protection devices, so all your protection relays typically communicate back to the HMI system. Those are all in scope for NERC CIP. Pretty much every electrical device that has a communication port that is addressable is in scope for NERC CIP. So we'll go over some of the NERC CIP reliability standards. I won't go through them all because there's quite a few, but I'll highlight some of the more important ones here. First one is CIP 005. This is your electronic security perimeter. So this would cover anything for any firewalls that you have set up in the system, all your router settings, any of the electronic devices that define the perimeter of your network would be classified as an ESP, electronic security perimeter. So even if there's no externally routable connections, your internal network and the perimeter of devices around that internal network form your ESP. All your ESPs need to be documented and verified to be compliant, and typically you would have multiple ESPs and each needs to be identified. CIP 008, Incident Reporting and Response Time, Response Planning. So when a NERC CIP incident occurs, how is it reported? What kind of incidents are reported? And what is the immediate response when an incident occurs? So not necessarily all incidents are reported immediately. NERC CIP defines an incident as maybe a potential violation, a PV. So different classifications of PVs, they maybe need to be reported immediately, but typically a lot of them wouldn't. There's monthly reporting and annual reporting where you would declare, you would self-report your PVs for review by regulators. CIP 010. This is your configuration change management and vulnerability assessment. So how are NERC CIP assets disposed of? If you've got an old asset or a failed piece of equipment or maybe something that needs to come out of the system, you can't just throw it in the dumpster behind the building. It does need to be disposed of properly because it does contain NERC CIP confidential data. So it does need to be disposed of in a safe manner to make sure that nobody can access that data. Typically, it would be shredding the piece of equipment. It could be as simple as hitting it with a hammer just so that the data is no longer accessible on the device. But you do need to document and dispose of old assets, NERC CIP assets properly. Then when the new device is installed in the system, how is the NERC CIP asset replaced? The new asset needs to be configured, documented, and confirmed compliant before being added to in-service NERC CIP assets. So that configuration would be downloaded from the previous device or from your historical records so that it's configured, it's NERC CIP compliant, all the tasks and evidence have been gathered to demonstrate that that device is NERC CIP compliant. When is a vulnerability assessment required and how is it done? So a vulnerability assessment is required before you place the equipment in service and must be updated accordingly if there's any changes to the system. CIP 014, physical security. So this would be your card lock systems or your controlled access to the facilities, your perimeter fencing, and then these physical barriers, how is access requested and approved to get within the NERC CIP inside the physical perimeter. And then the last one that we'll highlight here is CIP 011, cybersecurity, and this is really the meat and potatoes of what NERC CIP is all about. This covers your port scans, your screenshots of security software installations, documenting firmware and software versions, as well as the business justification for open ports. And we'll go through each one of these in a lot more detail in the next few slides here. So the first thing to be done is to categorize your NERC CIP assets. So this is your BES cyber system categorization, your bulk electric system, cyber system categorization. And it's classified in 3 different impact ratings. A high impact rating, medium impact rating, and a low impact rating. There are some ratings in between there. You can get a medium plus impact rating, but we won't focus on those for right now. We'll focus on high, medium, and low. So a high impact rating facility would be your control center or your backup control center. Anything that if that central control center was compromised and you no longer were able to access those facilities or use them to operate the system, that would have a high impact on your bulk electric system. A medium impact rating would be any of your in-service generation, transmission facilities operated at 500 kilovolts or higher, or any of your transmission facilities that are identified as essential to nuclear facilities. So this is probably where you'll find the bulk of your NERC CIP efforts is in your medium impact rating. Typically, a lot of the assets you'll be dealing with will fall into one of those categories there. And then low impact rating would be anything. Low impact rating would be anything that would be your typical transmission stations or your substations that aren't necessarily essential services. If you lost that particular substation, you've got options to route distribution power through other stations or other lines. The impact of losing one of those facilities would be low. So when it comes to NERC CIP, there's two portions of activities that need to take place. There's the NERC CIP tasks, and there's NERC CIP evidence to be gathered. So let's go through each one of those right now. The first one being NERC CIP tasks. The largest bulk of effort as part of NERC CIP compliance is the port scans that you'll be doing. Port scans are performed on all NERC CIP assets, and there's a few methods to do this. Command line execution of netstat. It will scan all the IP addresses and all the open ports on your system. There's other software packages you can use to do this. There's a Nessus vulnerability report that can be generated by a separate software package here. Each of these software packages scan all your IP addresses and confirm which ports are open and which ports are closed. Your contract may require to use one or the other methods for port scanning. And for example, the last project I work on required netstat to be used for port scans. But either way, it's performing the same function to confirm which ports are open and which ports are closed. These scans can take a long time. They can take many hours, sometimes overnight. And it's not uncommon for these scans when you start them that they only get 80% complete and then they fail and need to be restarted. So typically you would set your port scan up at the end of the day once you're done commissioning and leave it run overnight. You come in the morning and find out that it failed at 80%. Well, that's really frustrating that you can't necessarily do the scans during the day while commissioning is taking place. So you try again the next night and let it run overnight and hope that it works. I've seen lots of frustration with completing port scans. They can take a lot of time and do need some dedicated focus to get completed. So once your port scans are complete, then what you need to do is perform a business justification for any open ports. If no business justification can be determined, ports must be closed, as in there must be a valid reason why a port is open, as in there's a service in your system that's actually using that open port. But if there's no business justification for that, it must be closed. However, this isn't all that straightforward because often you're dealing with vendor equipment and you don't necessarily know the internal workings of their equipment. You have to contact the vendor and find out if there is a business justification for that particular open port. The vendor doesn't necessarily know, or maybe their equipment doesn't have that capability to close that port. It can be a bit of a back and forth to figure out a business justification. Either way, if it's determined that it's a hardware limitation of why the port cannot be closed, then that must be documented as part of your business justification for open ports. Even if you have an unconnected port, so you've got say a Cat6, Cat5 connection, but there's no LAN cable connected in there, it's just an open port. That port still needs to be filled with a physical plug and a picture taken to show that the ports are physically closed with some sort of sticker that you would indicate if there was any tampering with the system so that it would prevent anyone from locally accessing the system. Some more tasks are documenting your firewall rules. Each firewall is configured as part of your ESP, your electronic security perimeters, and the configuration needs to be documented and confirmed to be correct across the entire ESP. And here's another large task is updating drivers, software, and firmware. All security patches need to be applied to ensure the drivers and software are most current. And there must be a process to track any future released updates. So when the equipment arrives at site, it will arrive with a certain version of software and drivers and firmware, and that's all fine. You'll start commissioning the equipment with that. But during your commissioning period, it's very likely that some of those software systems have patches that are issued, and you need to be able to track all these patches so that at in-service date, you know that everything's update and current, and there's no vulnerabilities in the system. Um, that needs to happen at a certain frequency after in-service date. During commissioning, there's a bit of a grace period, and you may choose to proceed through commissioning with a stable version of software and only update it at the end, but then that can potentially introduce issues. If you update all your patches right before in-service date, you need to prove that they don't necessarily upset the system. Some retesting to be done. It can get a bit complicated and a bit busy at the end there to confirm that everything's updated and that everything still functions per the contract. Either way, the system must be confirmed to be current at in-service date to ensure NERC CIP compliance. So the other large task is gathering all the NERC CIP evidence. So this would consist of taking screenshots of your systems to confirm or demonstrate that a particular software version or firmware version is installed. On a PC system, you can take screenshots of maybe your security patch that you've installed or your virus detection software that's installed. On non-PC based systems, maybe it's an LED screen on a pump control panel that you take a picture of, and it would show the particular firmware version that's being run on that pump control panel. All of your open port justifications form a part of your NERC CIP evidence, the results of your port scans, and this can generate mountains of documentation. Some of it's required to be submitted to regulators at in-service date, while others of it needs to be held on to available for when a future audit could be done by regulators at a future date. So if you need to be gathering evidence because at a later date you won't be able to because the systems are in service, you can't shut them off or you can't access the systems due to electrical clearances, whatever that could be, is you need to have that evidence in hand so that you can produce it for regulators at a later date. So there's maybe a couple different approaches to gathering evidence. Regardless of how you choose to gather the evidence, all NERC CIP tasks need to be completed without exception. You need to do all your port scans, you need to have all your business justifications in place. All the NERC CIP tasks need to be complete. So when it comes to evidence, however, though, sometimes there's a huge amount of devices on your project. You may have 1,000 devices or more on a project. For example, my last project had over 1,200 in-scope NERC CIP assets, all requiring compliance. It was a huge task. But what we did was some of those devices are identical. You may have 20 interface cards to the same 20 pumps. And by similarity, you can show that the evidence that applies to one applies to all of those 20 devices. So we identified, say, one of those devices as a typical device, and we gathered all the evidence for that device, and then by similarity showed that the evidence for this device and the firmware version, say, is the same for all 20 of those devices. And that was a huge time saver. Otherwise, I don't know if we would have made it on time to be NERC CIP compliant. So it can be a large effort to gather all this evidence, but that method to show of a typical device did help us to achieve our milestone there. Another aspect of NERC CIP is password management. So when your equipment arrives at site, it may have all the factory default passwords installed for user admin, password admin, and that's fine for commissioning because it's actually easier for commissioning. There's going to be lots of people accessing the equipment, and default passwords are probably just fine for commissioning. However, passwords need to be changed just prior to in-service date. There would have been a whole bunch of people accessing all the systems during commissioning, and that needs to be closed before going into a service. And then from the in-service date onwards, only individuals that are authorized to obtain the password and access the device will be issued the password. Often devices only support a single user interface. Unlike a PC, you could have multiple users that are logging into a PC, but for say a pump control panel or something, it would only have a certain version of software and maybe only one user access interface for that device. So you definitely need to change that password so that only authorized people can access that particular piece of equipment. Another aspect to manage during commissioning and after commissioning is who has access to the NERC CIP data. So NERC CIP data during and after the project needs to be protected. All the NERC CIP evidence that is gathered needs to have controlled access. So that's not too bad because as you're gathering the evidence, you can be placing it in a controlled location. But where it gets a bit more complicated is that some of the project documents will need to have access control. Any drawing or document that contains an IP address is deemed a NERC CIP asset. So then what do you do? If you go through all your drawing packages and determine that 1 in 10 or 1 in 20 drawings has an IP address, those drawings definitely need to be controlled. But do you try and filter out just that subset of drawings and say they're NERC CIP and need access management? That can get quite tricky too. So then likely what you do is you say all of the project data needs to be NERC CIP controlled so that you don't have to try and filter out which drawings are NERC CIP and which ones are not. And then you need to establish a data repository of who has access to all of the project data. So this can start quite early in the project to ensure that you're NERC CIP compliant at in-service date. Access requests to then all of the project data will require a PRA, a personal risk assessment, to determine if access can be granted, and only once the PRA is returned as all clear can access to the project documentation be granted. With online data systems that are accessed from all over the world, this can be quite challenging to implement and maintain. For example, on our last project, we had individuals from Canada, United States, Germany, Spain, all over the world, and each required a PRA before being granted access to the data systems to access the project documents. It was a huge undertaking, but had to be done to be NERC CIP compliant. And then, of course, all of your NERC CIP passwords need to be managed to control who has access to devices. Only passwords given out to authorized individuals, and you need a process to be able to manage that of who can request access, granting access, and then administering those passwords. So as you can see, there's a lot of effort required for NERC CIP compliance. And then how do you pull this off while you're trying to commission a system? During commissioning, there's a lot going on. And then throw NERC CIP on top of that, it can get quite complex. And how do you accomplish this during on-site commissioning? There's 2 milestones to consider to determine when in-scope assets need to be NERC CIP compliant. So the first milestone would be when the devices are first connected to the bulk electric system or first connected to other already in service NERC CIP assets. That's the first milestone. Really, that would be, say, at the start of commissioning. And then the second milestone to consider is when the assets are placed into commercial service. So at in-service date. Really, that first milestone and that second milestone determine the start and the end of commissioning. In order to complete NERC CIP tasks and gather evidence, often devices need to be powered and possibly connected to in-service assets. So you get in a situation, a bit of a situation of a chicken and an egg, is you need to gather the evidence, but you can't necessarily gather the evidence until it's connected to the NERC CIP assets. But you need to have the evidence to confirm that it's compliant before connecting it to the NERC CIP assets. So there's a bit of a chicken and an egg situation there, and thankfully there is a bit of a grace period during commissioning where you'll be gathering some of these, completing some of these tasks and gathering evidence to confirm in-service compliance at in-service date. However, you still will want to perform as many of the tasks and gather as much evidence as possible in advance of when you're first making those connections to in-scope NERC CIP assets. However, the final tasks will require network connections to be established. For example, if you're doing port scans, they may require the network to be connected in order to scan the entire network ring for open ports. And thankfully, during that grace period, it can be a very busy period. You can complete some of the last remaining tasks for NERC CIP compliance. Without exception, though, all NERC CIP tasks need to be completed and all evidence gathered before the assets are placed into commercial service. The system will not be deemed NERC CIP compliant if all tasks are not complete and evidence gathered at in-service date. If you did do this, this would be your first PV, your first potential violation, to self-report to regulators if this critical cybersecurity milestone is not achieved. Essentially, the situation you'll be in is your in-service date will need to be delayed until all NERC CIP tasks are complete and all evidence has been gathered. And it will not go over very well with the owner of the project if you have to tell them that their in-service date is delayed due to NERC CIP requirements. It's a huge push at the end of the project to complete all the tasks and all the evidence, but it must be completed in order to complete the project and hand over to the owner. During the grace period during commissioning, physical security perimeters need to be established and access controls in place to ensure that only authorized personnel are on site who could potentially access the NERC CIP assets. This can definitely be a huge undertaking and does need a dedicated team to focus on completing the tasks and gathering the required evidence. So once you meet this huge milestone of compliance, then there's somewhat of a soft transition, hopefully, to the project team completing all of this, to the operations team continuing with ongoing NERC CIP compliance, but the effort doesn't stop there. There's still a huge task to maintain your NERC compliance that you've achieved. The largest task to maintain NERC CIP compliance is application of software patches. So at in-service date, everything's current, but as time goes on, firmware and software updates are regularly issued by the manufacturer of the equipment. So each of these sources of updates need to be monitored to alert if new software patches are issued. When new software patches are issued, the NERC CIP compliance team needs to assess each software patch. And if it's determined to not cause issues within the system, it must be applied within 30 days of being issued. Any software patches that are deferred to annual maintenance or not applied need a business justification of why it is not being applied within the 30 days. So think about this. This software assessment of software patches can be quite difficult. You know how often Microsoft issues a patch for Windows. Every time that one of those software patches is issued, it needs to be assessed and determined if it doesn't cause issues within the system, if it doesn't open up new vulnerabilities within the system, and can safely be applied to the NERC CIP assets. But how is anybody going to know what exactly that Microsoft software patch is doing? Unless you work at Microsoft, you have no way of knowing and assessing exactly how that patch is going to behave within your system. And assessment of these patches can get quite complicated. Say there was a new version of firmware that was updated for a particular pump controller. You would have no way of knowing or assessing whether that firmware upgrade is going to cause issues with your system or open up new vulnerabilities, or if it is in fact NERC CIP compliant. Regardless, this assessment needs to take place in 30 days. So what do? Sometimes a replica of the control systems need to be in place in order to apply the updates to the replica, Perform all your port scans, gather the evidence, and confirm that it doesn't cause any issues with the system and is in fact NERC compliant. Once you've done that on the replica, then you can apply the software patch on the live system. With the replica in play there and assessment of patches, this all still needs to be done within 30 days of the patch being issued in order for it to be applied and in order to remain NERC CIP compliant. So this does require a dedicated team and is a huge effort to keep up with NERC CIP compliance. Also, hardware may fail and need to be replaced during the life of the system. The NERC CIP team will need to ensure that old assets are destroyed properly, that new assets are configured correctly, and that tasks are completed, evidence is gathered to maintain your NERC CIP compliance. As people come and go from working with the NERC CIP systems, PRAs will need to be completed, access requests reviewed and approved, and card lock systems synced to ensure the correct people have access to the appropriate systems. So I would like to stress that NERC CIP compliance can be a costly endeavor to obtain and maintain, but may be required depending on the impact rating of the equipment being developed. A few tips that I can give is you do need to ensure that your NERC CIP requirements are clearly defined at the beginning of your project and the appropriate budgets are established to cover the cost to achieve compliance. It is very difficult approaching the end of the project trying to scramble to obtain compliance with no budget in the project estimate. As well, a helpful tip for operators at in-service date and beyond, operating budgets should be reviewed to establish funds for personnel to maintain NERC CIP compliance after project completion. So that's a little bit of an overview of how cyber compliance works in North America. I'm sure it's different elsewhere in the world. NERC is a North American standard, but there may be other standards elsewhere in the world, and it's likely very similar to ensure cyber compliance. But as our systems become more and more complicated in the world, cyber security definitely becomes more and more of an issue and more of a concern. You do hear stories in the news of systems being jeopardized and power being disturbed within systems, and it is a topic of more and more concern as things go forward. What really drove the NERC CIP standards in North America was, however many years ago, I forget, was when there was a large power outage on the eastern seaboard of the US. There was something like 50 million people that were out of power for a few days as there was a cascading power event that took out all those power systems. And that's when regulators really dug into reliability of the systems, and NERC CIP became even more of a priority since then. If that was maybe like 10 or 15 years ago, I can't remember. So that's a bit of an overview, and I hope you found that helpful, and definitely open up to any questions that you have here. One thing I would like to point out before we move into the Q&A is I will be launching my electrical commissioning course very soon. October 5th is the date when we'll have it available. It consists of 18 videos on the commissioning process. It's got six lessons on electrical systems, and we will have a special offer with a 50% discount only for a short time starting October 5th. So mark your calendars and watch for those emails to come soon. So this was a bit of a complex topic. I hope there's lots of questions, and I'll start getting into the questions here now. So the first question from Achuko, I saw you joined a little bit late. So at the beginning of the presentation, we covered what is NERC CIP. So NERC CIP is the cybersecurity list of standards that govern electrical systems in North America and define the tasks and evidence required in order to maintain NERC CIP compliance. So really it's about securing your electrical systems so that it's not vulnerable to other people logging in, hacking into the system, manipulating switch yards, or controlling some of the devices within your facility to disrupt power systems to your customers and to other utility connections as well. It's really the electronic cyber security rules that you need to meet in order to be NERC CIP compliant. And sometimes, in the case where I am here anyways, is when you're interconnected with other utilities, it's a requirement that if you're interconnected with them, you must be NERC CIP compliant because they don't want your facilities to cascade and start taking out their facilities. So in order to have some inter-transfer agreements between utilities, you do have to demonstrate NERC CIP compliance. If you're not NERC CIP compliant, then they won't necessarily accept power from you or allow sales to other neighboring jurisdictions, and you do have to maintain your NERC CIP compliance for that reason. So next question is from Fami. In a normal operation, how if we remote EWS to modify a program from a personal computer, is it allowed? As we know, usually engineering workstation is a common tool for modifying program. This is always a good question. Yep, during commissioning, it's often that the vendor might have the ability to remote into the system, and that definitely can be very helpful during commissioning if not all the resources are on site. If someone that's off-site is able to log into the system and make any changes, then that can certainly be helpful. But at in-service date, all those connections need to be shut off at either in more likely physically disconnected, so that if there's a device there that allows that remote login connection, that device would physically be removed so that there is no ability to remote log into the system. That is a vulnerability that can exist, and it must be closed at in-service date. Now, there is very complex methods to put in place to allow external connections to exist through VPN connections, through other more complex connections, so that outside people with the proper authorizations can access the system. But typically, that's not the approach. Is typically those types of connections would be shut down and disabled. When it comes to something like your central control facility that's monitoring the systems, what my experience is we installed an RTU, a remote terminal unit, so that serial connection, that LAN connection from the central control location to, say, this RTU unit is externally routable connection, but then the RTU is really that break in connection between the external network and the internal network. And any connection between those two is strictly either RS-232 serial or discrete logic, so that there is no routable connection from the outside world to the inside world. There's just no physical way to possibly do that. You can only communicate through discrete logic or through RS-232 for that very reason, so that nobody external can get into your system, get any further, and start messing with any of the devices in the system. Worst cases, they could toggle your discrete logic high and low, which would still cause issues, but they can't necessarily get into the system and start changing passwords and locking others out of the system. So those external connections are a big concern, and definitely need to be shut off at in-service date, or with more complex methods put in place to manage those external connections. So Sammy's got a good question here, and I'm living through this issue right now, is why are we, the commissioning team, always struggling with the QC department? Really, the quality management system that's set up during construction is really the first piece that's going to set up commissioning for success on site. If the construction team has a very strong quality management system, then commissioning is going to go a lot better. If the construction team is more just winging it and making things up as they go and kind of inspecting things or not, which is maybe more of my experience, then yeah, you're going to have issues with the quality of the devices that you're receiving from the construction group and the QC department. The best thing I can suggest is to very clearly, crystal clear, define the mechanical completion handover between those two groups. The earlier you can do this and the more detailed you can make it, the easier it's going to be for everybody to understand what are their expectations to meet for that critical handover stage. If mechanical completion is clearly defined and the scope of what's being handed over the scope of the quality inspections, and exactly what needs to be complete. Then when that mechanical completion is signed, everybody understands that's the transfer of care, custody, and control from one group to the other, and both groups know exactly what's required of them and exactly what's being handed over from one group to the other. Um, it does seem to be a challenge in the projects I've worked on, comments from other people, that handover stage is probably the most difficult thing that exists in commissioning, is to establish a smooth handover from construction to commissioning. And I always see it being a struggle as well. And uh, even trying to define that mechanical completion handover well in advance, everybody still wants to change things and do something different, and then schedules get pushed and everything's tight. Everybody wants to try and cut corners. It's definitely is a challenge, but that's the best thing that I found, is to try and manage expectations in advance with clearly defined mechanical completions. So Nonalin's got a question here. In your area, who is responsible for maintaining NERC CIP? So in our last project, that was largely the commissioning team's responsibility to obtain NERC CIP compliance. So we had a dedicated team of 4 or 5 people that were part of our commissioning team and were completing all these tasks and gathering all the evidence to meet that critical milestone to say, okay, now we are NERC CIP compliant. At in-service date, ideally, that is turned over to the operating team, and they've got resources to maintain the new assets as well as all the existing assets in the system to maintain NERC CIP compliance. Although NERC CIP is such a huge task that it's not all that fair on day one of operation to say, here you go, operations, it's yours now, run with it. So what we did was we supported them with a soft handover, having our dedicated NERC CIP team of 5 people continue on after in-service date and kind of slowly transition out of that role as the operating team became more familiar with the systems and could integrate the systems into their existing NERC CIP compliance tasks. And that worked much better than trying to just dump this on operations and say, here you go, good luck. Um, that wouldn't have worked very well. But in our case, it did work really well. Over about a 6-month period of time from a service date afterwards, for 6 months, we helped them along and got them up and running on the tasks that were completed, and so that they could maintain compliance going forward. So then they've got, in the project I last worked on, they had a NERC CIP compliance team that was focusing on these assets as well as every other asset in the system to maintain compliance. It just took some time for them to incorporate these new assets into their existing processes. But that's a very good question, because it does require some dedicated resources after in-service date to maintain NERC CIP compliance. I would be interested in if anybody's got any comments on what are the standards, or how is cybersecurity managed or regulated in other parts of the world. I know in North America it's NERC CIP, but I know it's not that. It'll be something different elsewhere in the world. And I'm just wondering if anybody has any comments on how or their experiences elsewhere in the world on cyber compliance, either in obtaining compliance or experience with any incidents of a cyber breach where any of your facilities have been tampered with, or if there's been any issues with cybersecurity elsewhere in the world. If you've got any thoughts or comments on that, please enter those into the chat box as well. So another question that's come up is, what are the latest trends in commissioning cybersecurity? Let's maybe discuss that from the aspect of how are these activities overlapped during the commissioning period. There's a lot going on with commissioning. Commissioning of itself is a big enough task. Throwing on NERC CIP compliance on top of that is even maybe doubles the effort. I don't know. It's a huge effort to do those in parallel. And I would say that cybersecurity is a fairly new topic that to try and pull this off, a lot of companies are still learning exactly what is required for NERC CIP compliance, particularly for international companies that work all over the world. NERC CIP compliance would apply in North America, but there'd be different standards elsewhere in the world, and it's definitely a learning experience for everyone to figure out what this all means, how to obtain compliance, and how to maintain compliance. So from a trend standpoint, it's more of a I would say it's more of a learning approach. Is often you may have to work very closely with the contractor to help everyone understand what are these NERC CIP requirements, what are we trying to achieve here, and how are we going to obtain NERC CIP compliance. Um, the biggest hesitation there would be maybe underestimating the level of effort required to do this. Contractors may feel that the commissioning guys can do this, they can just do it in their spare time, whatever, but I've never seen any commissioning guys with any spare time. That you definitely need to have those discussions and help everyone realize that this is a big task and it is going to require some dedicated resources, not just your commissioning guys and say, hey guys, go figure this out. Um, so it's definitely a bit of a process to coordinate those two activities for commissioning and NERC CIP compliance. When you're working on the systems, commissioning them, you're making changes, as you should be during commissioning to get the system fine-tuned. But those changes impact the evidence you've gathered for NERC CIP, the tasks to be completed to obtain compliance. So you do have to schedule it pretty closely. That okay, if you are going to overlap this, then if you're determining that this particular subsystem is complete, okay, now the NERC CIP team can move in there to complete their tasks and gather their evidence. If the commissioning team needs to go back there and make some changes to the system, well, then that's going to require the NERC CIP team to go back in there and redo some of their efforts. Alternatively, you push all the NERC CIP tasks right to the very end of the project when commissioning is complete, and it's very rushed to gather all this evidence, or you allow the time in the project schedule to push out the in-service date to gather all this evidence. It's definitely a bit of a balancing act. Um, I would say those are kind of the local trends or the local issue, the latest issues and trends on NERC CIP compliance is just the sheer magnitude of trying to obtain compliance and managing that with amongst all the other commissioning activities that are taking place at a very busy period of the project when we're trying to get a system in service. So another question is, how do we mitigate from NERC CIP non-compliant to compliant? Can you give us some ideas? This is quite common, yeah, and we went through this at the utility I was working at several years ago because none of the systems they were installed like 20, 30 years ago were never NERC CIP compliant. That just wasn't a consideration. But as NERC CIP compliance becomes more common and is a requirement to interconnect with neighboring utilities, then at some point you do need to deem that the systems are NERC CIP compliant. So that is a big task in its own. Is think of a large utility network and none of it's NERC CIP compliant. It's the very similar process to putting a project in service. Is you take each portion of the system and you just start going through and completing the tasks and gathering the evidence. Some of the older systems are actually easier to obtain NERC CIP compliance. If you've got non-digital systems, more mechanical relay systems, and those are super simple because they don't have any externally routable connections or addressable connections. But invariably, a lot of your PLC control systems that weren't NERC compliant, you do need to go through all of those and perform all the NERC CIP tasks, gather all the evidence, and demonstrate that it is NERC CIP compliant. So when the system was first installed maybe 20 years ago, you wouldn't have done all those port scans because NERC CIP compliance wasn't a concern. So now you're going to go through and you're going to perform all those port scans and do all your open port justifications to confirm which ports are open and which ports are closed. Now you will have to be somewhat careful in doing this because if you've determined that you want to close some ports on a system that's been functioning without issue for 20 years, you want to make sure you're not damaging anything or going to break any of the connections by closing that open port. So likely when you're doing those business justifications of open ports, you're probably going to have a really good reason to close that port, as equally as having a very good reason why that port is open. But it's very similar to putting a project in service, is you just have to go through the effort and perform all the tasks, all the port scans, gather all the evidence, and confirm that your system is NERC CIP compliant or not. any gaps in compliance. Maybe the systems can be modified with additional settings or closing some of the ports. If the piece of equipment just cannot be deemed to be NERC CIP compliant, then maybe there are a few odd systems that need to be replaced or upgraded or something that can be deemed NERC CIP compliant. That wasn't so much our experience, is the equipment that was out there all functioned properly, and there was very few pieces of equipment that had to be replaced that couldn't be proved to be NERC compliant through port scans and the open port justifications. Um, so when you use the term migrate, I wouldn't necessarily say that you're replacing a bunch of the equipment, because that wouldn't be very desirable. But it's more the effort to go through and perform all the tasks and gather all the evidence to show that your already existing systems are in fact NERC CIP compliant, with maybe a few hardware pieces that you may have to change, and maybe a more so a focus on making sure that all your software patches and your firmware in your systems are all up to date. And that could definitely be a challenge too, because maybe the vendor from 20 years ago is no longer around. So how do you have a contact to confirm the internals of that system? How do you confirm that you do have the most current version of firmware installed? It can be challenging from that aspect, and maybe you just can't for that particular piece of equipment. The vendor's no longer around. That piece maybe does have to be replaced because there is no other way to determine if it is in fact NERC CIP compliant. So hope that answers your question. Definitely a big task. If you look at one project that is maybe one substation, that's a huge enough task to get that system NERC compliant. If you've got a utility that's covers a huge area and it's got transmission facilities, generation, and substations all over the place, well, then this can be a huge effort for the NERC CIP team maybe to focus on one substation, go through all the tasks and evidence there, then move on to the next one. This can take years to go through and demonstrate NERC CIP compliance for a large utility. But definitely needs to be done, and in our case, it did take that long. It was a 2 or 3 year effort to get through and demonstrate NERC CIP compliance, as well as then maintaining that compliance as years go forward to show that the entire system is NERC CIP compliant. Maybe one thing that would help in there is that when you go through and classify all your assets as low, medium, and high impact, it would depend on how many of your assets are classified as medium, medium plus, or high impact. You maybe only have one or two high impact facilities. Most of them are going to be medium and medium plus. A lot of them are also going to be low impact. And for low impact, then there's minimal or less requirements for tasks and evidence to complete for NERC CIP compliance. It would just depend maybe on the configuration of your system and how detailed you need to get into the various aspects based on their assets, based on their impact rating. So if there's any more questions, please shoot them in here, and I'll continue to answer them. So I'm not seeing any more questions come in there. If you have any more questions on NERC CIP, don't hesitate to shoot me an email, and I'll see how I can help you out. We'll maybe end it there for the live Q&A session. I just wanted to give you one more heads up on mark your calendars for October 5th on some more details of our electrical commissioning course that'll be released then, and how you can receive an exclusive discount on this training. This electrical commissioning training course is, I can't find anything better on the internet. It's the most advanced electrical commissioning course that exists on the internet, as far as I can find. If you're aware of a more advanced electrical commissioning course, please send it my way, because I'd like to see it. But there's a pile of good information in here that I'm sure that you will like. So in order to access the certificate for this webinar, this is a sample of what the certificate will look like. And you can access, after completing a very short survey, there's a few questions we have there for some feedback on our webinar that we would really appreciate. You complete that, as well as your name and email, and we'll send you a copy of the certificate by email here, and you can access the certificate at www.commissioningandstartup.com/webinar-cert. Write that down, and you can go there right away and access the certificate after completing a very short survey there. So I also would like to give you a heads up that our next live webinar is on October 1st, and the topic for that live webinar is operational readiness. Operational readiness is another huge effort to take place during commissioning in parallel with commissioning in order that the operating team is fully comfortable and ready to operate and maintain the new facilities at in-service date. So we'll spend some time talking about commissioning team's role in preparing for operational readiness. So hope to see you there on October 1st. I'll send you some links so that you can sign up there to join the next discussion. And hope everyone enjoyed this discussion. Hope you found it helpful. And thanks for joining, and hope to see you at the next one.